Every picture you've ever seen of a dodo is probably wrong. The chubby, goofy cartoon bird from textbooks, memes, and Alice in Wonderland? Yeah, that dodo never really existed. The real bird likely looked very different. So where do you find the real image of the dodo? You look toward the artist who actually saw them. We're decoding the art of the dodo, because scientists working to bring the dodo back don't just need bones and DNA. They also need clues from the people who lived alongside these birds. Clues about what the animal may have truly looked like. So we sat down with an art historian helping scientists reconstruct an extinct species through centuries-old paintings. We're tracing the real dodo through the eyes of the artists who painted it to uncover what the bird actually looked like, how the wrong version took over the world, and how nearly forgotten paintings are now helping scientists rebuild it. And we'll answer the question, could we be looking at one again in our lifetime? This is Marine Saussier, an art historian and graduate of the École du Louvre in Paris. She wasn't supposed to end up working with de-extinction scientists. She was studying Dutch Golden Age paintings. Then her brother made a joke about the dodo and accidentally sent her down a rabbit hole that would eventually connect her with the team trying to bring the bird back.
My name is Marine Saussier. I specialized in history of European painting and Dutch painting in particular. I got very passionate about research while writing my thesis about the dodo, and so I decided to pursue it by doing a PhD in art and cultural history. I'm half French, half Mauritian. When you are in Mauritius, dodos are everywhere on the coins, in the market, a lot of souvenirs of the dodo. I've been fortunate enough to grow up in Paris, which allowed me to be very close to great monuments and museums that always fascinated me. My dad used to bring me to the Louvre with him every week, and that's how I became familiar with art, I guess.
This is the most famous dodo painting in the world, painted by Dutch artist Roland Savary in the 1620s. It's the reason we all picture the dodo as a chunky, awkward little gremlin. Savary worked in the court of Holy Roman Emperor Rudolph II, whose massive collections in Prague included exotic animals, preserved specimens, and sprawling cabinets of curiosities from across the known world. There's just one problem. The dodo Savary painted may not have looked much like a real dodo at all.
Roland Savary is really the most important painter. He is also sometimes named the Dodo's painter. Some researches have been made about to understand why they were chubby and obese in a way in the representations of Roland Savary. The answer is certainly it's because they were stuffed when they were brought in Europe.
What he painted was likely based on a very overstuffed specimen. But that one image became the dodo. Savary painted it again and again. His nephew Jan Savary copied it. Then other artists copied them. And suddenly this strange, swollen bird started spreading across Europe like a 400-year-old meme.
In the 19th century, for example, Lewis Carroll, the famous author of Alice in Wonderland, got inspired by the specimen of the dodo that was kept at Oxford, and used it to create the character of the dodo in his novel. It appears that the real name of Lewis Carroll was Charles Dodgson, and so it turns the dodo in a kind of self-portrait of himself in the novel. So it makes no doubt that the illustrator John Tenniel got inspired by the Roland Savary painting to represent the dodo. And actually, the printed version of Alice in Wonderland quickly spread all around the world. And that's actually one of the episodes that led to the current fame of the dodo as an icon of extinction. And it has been possible thanks to painting, basically.
Disney, Ice Age, Madagascar, memes, gifs, tattoos. Almost all of it traces back to one probably wrong painting. But while Savary was painting fantasy versions of the dodo in Europe, two other artists, working thousands of miles apart and never knowing each other existed, were doing something very different. They were painting the bird as it actually looked.
The two depictions, I think, are the most accurate to the dodo's anatomy. Were made in very different contexts, but similar backgrounds. The first one was made by Jacob Fufnagel at the court of Prague, where a dodo was kept at the menagerie of Rudolf II. The other one was kept in the royal court, that of Emperor Jahangir in India, and was represented by the Mughal artist Ustad Mansour.
But here's the question. The dodo lived on a single island in the Indian Ocean. So how did one end up in a palace in Prague and another in the Mughal courts of India? The answer is the Dutch East India Company. These guys were flinging dodos around as diplomatic gifts. Because in 17th century Europe, owning a rare animal wasn't just a curiosity, it was status, a flex, proof that your empire reached places other empires just couldn't. And inside these royal courts, artists weren't being paid to invent fantasy creatures or paint vibes. They were being paid to document the collections as accurately as possible.
Although they are considered scientifically accurate, I think we can still rely on art history and on the artist's motivation to understand this accuracy furthermore. First, the fact that they were both made in royal context and that they were represented in bestiaries is a good indicator. The motivation and mission of those two artists was above all to document the collections of naturalia of their own monarch. And in order to do so, they were very precise both in the rendering of the proportion, but also in the anatomy and in the use of the right colors.
And no one pushed that documentary precision further than Ustad Mansour. He was one of the greatest Mughal miniaturists of his generation. In his world, master painters used brushes made from a single squirrel hair, all to capture the smallest possible details with extreme precision.
The dodos that were represented in Europe at that time in earthly paradises, so it was more of a fantastical representation, whereas Ustad Mansour is really focused on the documental purpose of the representation.
400 years later, in a lab on the other side of the world, scientists are trying to bring the dodo back. Bones, tissue, ancient DNA, genome sequencing, the full Jurassic Park toolkit. But when you're trying to connect genes to visible traits, it still matters what the animal actually looked like. Written descriptions help, but paintings that accurately capture the bird, they're gold. So Marine got on a call with Colossal's avian team. She brought the Hofnagel painting, she brought the Mansour, and suddenly the art historian and the genome scientists were studying the same images for completely different reasons.
The thing is that we are working on the same images but for different purposes. They were actually really, I think, surprised and glad when I showed them the two most accurate depictions in my opinion, and they had some questions about those two pictures. For example, they were wondering if these dodos are male or female. Some dodos are represented with a tail and others aren't. So maybe it can be a track to distinguish. They were also really interested about all the questions about the colors of the feathers, for example. The feathers are not always represented the same colors. Sometimes they are a bit grayish, sometimes a bit more brownish. And in the two depictions, they have the same colors.
Then came one of the strongest reality checks yet. Scientists compared surviving dodo bones preserved in a museum in Denmark against the proportions in the Hofnagel painting, and the measurements lined up. And now the road back to the real dodo runs through a Mughal miniature, a Habsburg cabinet of curiosities, and a genetics lab in Texas, which honestly feels fitting, because the true story of the dodo has always been stranger than the cartoon version we inherited.
When I contact Colossal, I thought they would never answer to me because they were like a French student working on dodos and art history because they are scientists. Like I was completely wrong, and it was just really, really interesting and motivated to have that discussions with the team and with you today. So you have to be audacious to get what you want.
Here's the thing about the dodo. It isn't just a bird, it's the bird, the mascot of extinction. The dodo became famous as a joke, a cartoon, a punchline. But for 400 years, the real bird has been hiding inside that joke, in old oil paintings, in bones, in fragments of DNA. And now the mystery is slowly being solved, painting by painting, gene by gene. Because one day soon, we may not just remember the dodo, we may actually meet it again.